Hi class, good day. Hope you are doing fine all the time, no? Let's have an audio lang muna for today's lecture. And welcome to our lecture 5 with the title of Utilitarianism. This topic class is one of the main topics in ethics subject and also an important topic to be discussed before we will end the subject this semester. Let us start class. In life, plus have in life having a good choices or actions are very subjective. There are times we have choices that for us it is good, but not to other people. We can make straightforward decisions and actions through our human mind that are good, which do not require thorough explanation of moral ethics or theories. Utilitarianism suggests that we can decide what is morally right or morally wrong by weighing up or balancing which of our future possible actions promotes such goodness in our lives and the lives of people as well. Let us start explaining utilitarianism with an example. I got this from the book that we used, and probably you already read na about this. Of course, if you did an advanced reading. Let me read you the example. Imagine that Peter is an unemployed poor man in New York. Although he has no money, his family still depends on him. His unemployed wife Sandra is sick and needs $500 for the treatment, and their little children Anne and Sam have been thrown out of school because they could not pay tuition fees. Peter has no source of income and he cannot get a loan also. Even John, his friend and a millionaire, has refused to help him. From his perspective, there are only two alternatives. Either he pays by stealing or he does not. So, he steals 1,000 from John in order to pay for Sandra's treatment and to pay the tuition fees of Anne and Sam. One could say that stealing is morally wrong. Therefore, we will say that what Peter has done stealing from John is morally wrong. So, assume class that Peter has no other options but to steal. Wala siyang ibang option to get his income or to get money to pay the treatment of his wife and also to pay for the tuition fees of their children. This example answers the question, can the end justify the means? Meaning, can we justify that the stealing activity of Peter from John, whether or not could be considered ethically or morally bad or good? What we are weighing here, class, is the stealing activity and the reason of stealing. Now, what could be the suggestion of the utilitarianism about this type of situation? Based from utilitarianism, what Peter has done is morally right. So, paano nila nasabi na yung ginawa ni Peter na to steal is morally right or good? For utilitarians, stealing in itself is neither bad nor good, and what makes it bad or good is the consequences it produces. In our example, Peter stole from one person who has less need for the money and spent the money on three person na mas nangangailangan nung money na yon. And that was his wife for the treatment and to pay tuition fees for their children. Therefore, for utilitarians, Peter stealing from John, that's the means, can be justified by the fact that the money was used for the treatment of Sandra and for their children's tuition fees. That's the end. This justification is based on the calculation that the benefits of the theft outweigh or surpass the losses caused by the theft. Meaning class, the reason of Peter's stealing were justified by the utilitarianism's view. That's why they stated that what Peter did, the stealing was morally good or right, because they explained or based it from the reason of that stealing in which it gives good benefits to other people rather than dun sa taong pinagnakawan niya na si John. But it doesn't end there, class, no? Let us explore more kung ano yung pinaglalaban ng theory of utilitarianism of what is morally good and bad. So, paano ba nila na-evaluate yung ethical or moral goodness and rightness, or the badness or the wrongness. The aim of this chapter is to explain or examine the strengths and the weaknesses of utilitarianism. The discussion divided into three parts. The first one explains what utilitarianism is. The second discusses some varieties or types of utilitarianism. And the third one explores whether utilitarianism is persuasive and reasonable. What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is originally in a form of consequentialism. If you can still remember from the previous chapter, the consequentialism theory means the moral rightness or the wrongness of an act depends on the consequences it produces. On consequentialist grounds, actions and the inactions whose negative consequences outweigh the positive consequences will be deemed morally wrong, while the actions and inactions whose positive consequences outweigh the negative consequences will be deemed morally right. That's from the consequentialism grounds class. Here naman sa utilitarian grounds, the actions and inactions which benefit few people and harm more people will be morally wrong, while the actions and inactions which harm fewer people and benefit more people will deemed morally right. Even though the utilitarianism was originated from the consequentialism point of view, meron pa rin siyang differences. From the consequentialist grounds class, they based their moral goodness and wrongness through the negative or the positive consequences. Here in utilitarian grounds, they depend or they focused on the benefit of the people. Let us proceed to the two persons behind the utilitarianism point of view. Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill are known for classical utilitarians. They defined benefit and harm in terms of happiness or unhappiness and pleasure or pain. On this view, actions and inactions that cause less pain or unhappiness and more pleasure or happiness than available alternative actions and inactions will be deemed morally right, while those actions and inactions that cause more pain or unhappiness and less pleasure or happiness will be deemed morally wrong. Although pleasure and happiness can have different meanings, no, but in this context of this chapter, we will treat the pain, we will treat pleasure and happiness as synonymous or same lang yung meaning for this context. Utilitarians' concern is how to increase the net utility. It refers to the satisfaction we receive from consuming good or service or the actions. Their moral theory is based the utilitarian or the utilitarianism based on the principle of utility, which states that the morally right action is the action that produces the most good, stated by Driver 2014. Again, the morally right action is the action that produces the most good. Moral right action produces the most good. That's the principle of utility. Yan yung na-derive yung explanation nila ng utilitarianism. The morally wrong action is the one that leads to the reduction of the maximum good. For instance, a utilitarian may argue that although some armed robbers, for example, rob a bank in a heist, as long as there are more people who could benefit that stealing or robbery, like for example, kay Robin Hood, no, in which he robbed just to share the money dun sa mga tao na nangangailangan. Then, those person who suffer from the robbery, like for example, those billionaire who owns that bank, will bear the cost of the loss. The heist will be morally right, yung ginawa, yung pag-rob, rather than morally wrong. This utilitarian premise, if more people suffer from the heist, if maraming tao ang nag-suffer dun sa ginawa na activity na yon, and there are fewer people who could benefit that kind of activity, then that action will be morally wrong. Unless lang kung yung pag-rob ng bank is for those people na na mas kailangan yung pera na yon. So that action of robbing the bank could be morally right if it will base it or evaluate it from utilitarianism point of view. Utilitarianism opposed the deontology, which is this is a type of moral theory that says that as moral agents, we have certain duties or obligations, and these duties or obligations are formalized in terms. In short, we based or evaluate our moral actions through the formalized terms of rules or mga duties or rules in a society or us as an individual. There is a variant of utilitarianism named rule utilitarianism. It provides rules for evaluating the utility of actions and inactions. So, what is the difference between this utilitarian rule, one of the variant in utilitarianism, and the deontological rule? Rule utilitarians acting according to the rule is correct because the rule is one that will produce the most good only if it is widely accepted and followed. While in the ontologist rule, according to it, according to the deontologist, whether the consequences of your actions have positive or negative result or consequences, it doesn't determine the moral rightness or the moral wrongness of your doing. What determines their moral rightness or moral wrongness is whether we act or fail to act in accordance with our duty or duties. And our duty is based on rules that are not justified by the consequences and the one that is formalized or formally accepted and we followed. Now, there are varieties or some types in utilitarianism to make it defined easier. First, we can distinguish between the actual consequence utilitarians and the foreseeable consequence utilitarians. Second, we can make Uh, the second distinction we can make is that between the act utilitarianism and the rule utilitarianism. The actual consequence utilitarians, they base the evaluation of the moral rightness and moral wrongness of actions on the actual consequences of the actions, while the foreseeable consequence utilitarians, they base their evaluation of the moral rightness and moral wrongness of actions on the foreseeable or prediction or the foresight consequences of the actions. Let us explain the difference of these two through the example of JJC Smart. This is from your book. For example, imagine that that you rescued someone from drowning. You were acting in good faith to save a drowning person. So you are the person who saved that drowning person. But it just so happened that the person later became a mass murderer. Since the person became a mass murderer, this actual consequence utilitarian would argue that in hindsight, or you're understanding the situation or event after it had happened, so your action of saving that drowning person or rescuing that person is morally wrong because we evaluate the result of your action after that event. However, here in foreseeable consequence utilitarians would argue that looking forward, example given, in foresight, it could not be foreseen, no, or hindi mo naman alam ang mangyayari after, or it's just your prediction lang. Yung prediction naman hindi naman nagsasabi na talagang mangyayari, 'di ba? That the person was going to be a mass murderer. So hindi mo masasabi na yung sinave mo na person is a mass murderer or not. Hence, the act of rescuing them was morally right. So you focused on on your own action kaysa dun sa result ng tinulungan mong person. Moreover, they could have turned out to be, for example, like Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther the King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr., in which case the action would be considered to be morally right by actual consequence utilitarians. So you see the difference class between the two. The actual consequence utilitarians, they base their evaluation of the moral rightness and moral wrongness through understanding the situation or event after it had happened. While the foreseeable consequence utilitarians naman, they base their evaluation of the moral rightness and the moral wrongness through focusing on their action or the respond or their actual action on that particular situation. The second distinction we can make is that between act utilitarianism and the rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism focuses on individual actions and says that we should apply the principle of utility in order to evaluate them. Therefore, act utilitarianism says that the action that produces the most utility or good would the morally right actions. However, this may seem impossible to do in practice since for everything that we do has a potential effect on other people. We would be morally required to examine first the consequences of our action and pick the one with the best outcome. Second, the rule utilitarianism. It responds to this problem by focusing on general types of actions and determining whether they typically lead to good or bad results. For them, the meaning of commonly held moral rules, commonly they are generalizations of the common consequences of our actions. For example, stealing is commonly leads to bad consequences, right? Stealing in general would be considered wrong based in rule utilitarian. Again, the act utilitarianism should apply the principle of the action that produces the most good is the best action that could be considered good, while rule utilitarianism focus on generalization result of the action to determine whether the action that we did could lead to good or bad. So that's the difference between act and rule utilitarianism. Hence, just like other theories class, the utilitarianism has objections also. Like for example, they questioned like the rights, the justice, and fair treatment in terms of the principle of utility by claiming that the rationale behind any such rule is really that these rules generally lead to greater welfare for all concerned. We may wonder whether utilitarianism in general is capable of even addressing the notion that people have rights and deserve to be treated justly and fairly. Because in critical situations, the rights and well-being of person can be sacrificed. Yung sa taong gumawa ng general na morally wrong, pero right naman siya after the consequences. So it could be unfair to that person. Pero kasi ang naka-benefit ng ginawa niya is yung mga taong natulungan or the reason behind that action. The rights and the well-being of person can be sacrificed as long as this seems to lead to an increase overall utility. Oh, just take this example class, the one of the famous example in ethics, no, the trolley problem. If you can remember, ito yung unang pre-assessment ko sa inyo. For example, in a version of the famous trolley problem, imagine that you and an overweight stranger are standing next to each other on a footbridge above a rail track. You discover that there is a runaway trolley rolling down the track, and the trolley is about to kill five people who cannot get off the track quickly enough to avoid the accident. Being willing to sacrifice yourself to save the five person, okay, na-stop na siya dito, naputol siya. You consider jumping off the bridge in front of the trolley, but you realize that you are far too light to stop the trolley. The only way you can stop the trolley, killing five people, is by pushing the large stranger off the footbridge in front of the trolley. If you push the stranger off, he will be killed, but you will save the other five. So assuming class no na this is a real life story, and then ang hirap kasi ang dami mong mga reasons on how to solve this kind of problem. And also, hindi mawawala yung sacrificial behavior na gagawin mo sa situation na to. And if we will base it on utilitarian point of view, someone have to sacrifice para someone would sacrifice pero that sacrifice would mean a lot or could benefit a lot to other people. So kaya nga lang meron ka ring ma-sacrifice na para sa'yo hindi dapat gawin. Pero because of that situation, gagawin mo na lang. So, sa ano yung mas isi-save mo, yung one person or the 5 person? Na in fact, when we talk humanity, na equal tayo lahat and we should treat fairly, no? Or we should treat fairly all the person na ma-encounter natin. So, medyo complicated siya na situation. But of course, kung darating man yung point na meron talagang mangyayaring hindi kaaya-aya sa decision mo, but it could benefit a lot, no, or yung consequence niya is magiging good result naman. So talagang gagawin mo talaga. And at the end, ikaw din talaga ang makapagsasabi na yung ginawa mong sacrificial na yon or na sacrifice na yun or the decision na yon is for your own good, and also additional na lang din yung ginawa mo siya para din sa welfare ng ibang tao. Utilitarianism, especially the ACT utilitarianism, seems to suggest that the life of the overweight stranger should be sacrificed regardless of any purported right to life he may have. However, may sagot naman si rule utilitarian. May respond that since in general killing innocent people to save others is not typically leads to the best outcomes, we should be very wary of making a decision to do so in this type of case. Since everything rests on our calculation of what might possibly stop the trolley, while in fact there is really far too much doubt in the outcome to warrant such a serious decision. If nothing else, the emphasis placed on general principles by rule utilitarians can serve as a warning not to take too lightly the notion about the ends might justify the means. The trolley example class has been extensively debated with reference as well as countless variations. So, ang dami niyang mga views about it. This actually brings us to our final question about utilitarianism, whether it is persuasive and reasonable approach to morality. First of all, let us start by asking about the principle of utility as serve as the foundational principle of morality. With the claim about what is morally right is just what leads to the better outcome. Morally right leads to better outcome. John Stuart Mill's argument that it is based on his claim that each person so far he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. Meaning, for him, Mill no, what is morality is about we desire our own happiness. Mill derives the principle of utility from this claim based on 3 considerations. So merong mga 3 factors si John Stuart Mill about the principle of utility or his basis na kung paano natin masasabi na our action is morally right and it leads to a better outcome. And these 3 considerations are desirability, exhaustiveness, and impartiality. And let me read this to you. In defending desirability, Mill argues that the only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. and so of the other sources of our experiences. In like manner, the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. In defending exhaustiveness naman, Mill does not argue that other things apart from happiness are not desired as such, but while other things appear to be desired, happiness is the only thing that is really desired, since whatever else we may desire, we do so because attaining that thing would make us happy. In defending impartiality, Mill argues that equal amounts of happiness are equally desirable, whether the happiness is felt by the same person or by different persons. In Mill's words, each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of all persons. We may wonder, however, whether his last argument about this impartiality is truly acceptable. Does Mill really show here that we should treat everyone's happiness as equally worthy of following? Or does he simply affirm or being positive to his statement? Kasi, because as you will understand no, from his statement that there is an equal happiness or equal desirable in each person, in which in reality naman is oo, meron in a family of course no na magkakaroon talaga siya ng equal happiness if someone attained his or her uh, desires no, pero kung meron namang mga ibang situations na nag magiging happy ka in that particular situation, but not generally naman na masasabi mong happy din yung ibang tao dun sa nagawa mo. So somehow, debatable din yung pag-defend ni John Stuart Mill about the impartiality of the principle of pursuing the principle of utility. Okay, let us agree, no, somehow that Mill's argument here is successful, and the principle of the utility is the basis of our morality. Utilitarianism claims that we should thus calculate to the best of our ability the expected utility that will result from our actions and how it will affect us and others, and use that as the basis of the moral evaluation of our decisions. But then, we may ask, how exactly do we quantify utility? So, paano ba natin mame-measure yung quantity or yung paano ba natin mame-measure yung utility ng nagawa natin na actions? Here, there are two different but related problems. Number one, how can I come up with a way of comparing different types of pleasures and pain, benefit or harm that I myself might experience? And number two, how can I compare my benefit and yours on some neutral scale of comparison? And this is the view of Bentham. Bentham famously claimed that there was a single universal scale that could enable us to objectively compare all the benefits and harms based on the following factors. So he proposes this following factors no for us to quantify the utility. First, the intensity of the situation or the action, the duration, the certainty or the uncertainty, proximity, fecundity, purity, and the extent. He offered on this basis what he called the philosophic calculus. It is a way of objectively comparing any two pleasures na na-experience mo in the particular situation. Okay, so meron tayong example dito. Sa book din ito, class, ha. Let us compare the pleasure of drinking a pint of beer to that of reading Shakespeare Hamlet. Suppose the following are the case. So assume, ha, na you have two pleasure or happiness. So same lang yun sila. It's about drinking beer or reading the Shakespeare Hamlet. So assume na ang dalawang situation na to or action na to is the one that desires you, that makes you happy, and this is or that makes you pleasurable. The pleasure derived from drinking a pint of beer is more intense than the pleasure derived from reading Hamlet. So suppose na ito yung mga nagawa mo na or ito na yung mga nagawa mong calculations based on the factors na pinopose ni Bentham. Second, the duration. The pleasure of drinking the beer lasts longer than that of reading the Hamlet. On certainty or uncertainty, we are confident that drinking the beer is more pleasure than reading the Hamlet. In proximity factor, the beer is closer to us than the play, and therefore it is easier for us to access the former than the latter. In fecundity, drinking the beer is more likely to promote more pleasure in the future, while reading Hamlet is less likely to promote more pleasure in the future. In purity, drinking the beer is pure pleasure, while reading Hamlet is mixed with something. And to the extent, finally, drinking the beer affects both myself and my friends in the bar, and so as a greater extent than my solitary reading of Hamlet. Since all of these measures, no, of these factors, drinking a pint of beer is more pleasurable than reading the Hamlet. It follows, according to Bentham, that it is objectively better for you to drink the beer, no, and forget about reading the Hamlet. And so you should. So mas marami yung based on the factors, no, based sa pag-calculate mo using those factors, mas madami yung pleasure mo sa pag-drink ng beer. So, ano ulit yung mga factors natin? The intensity, the duration, the certainty, and uncertainty, proximity, fecundity, purity, and the extent. And that Bentham at least claims that such a comparison is possible. So at least, no, positive yung statement somehow. We cannot be expected to always engage in very difficult calculations every single time you want to make a decisions. So, hindi naman siya lahat, no, na if you're in a difficult situations, like yung example kanina na naipit ka sa dalawang situation na desirable yung dalawang action na yun sa'yo, hindi naman siya mahirap din, no? Mahirap din siya mag-calculate using those factors in making your final decisions. But in an attempt to resolve this kind of problem, utilitarians claim that in the evaluation of the moral rightness and moral wrongness of actions, the application of principle of utility can be backward-looking based on hindsight or forward-looking based on foresight. We can also use our past experiences, no, of the result of our actions as a guide of estimating what could be the probable outcomes of our actions might be and save ourselves from the burden. And that it makes estimates, no, our choices that we may face in the future. However, meron namang banat si Mr. John Stuart Mill, no, that about the view of Bentham's about the Bentham's ano yun? Phili- philosophic calculus. According to Mill, Bentham calculus misses the fact that not all pleasures are equal. There are higher and lower pleasures that make it better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Mill justifies this claim by saying that between two pleasures, although one pleasure requires a greater amount of difficulty to attain than the other pleasure, if those who are competently acquainted with both pleasures prefer one over the other, then the one is a higher pleasure while the other is a lower pleasure. So according to Mill, meron tayong higher and lower pleasures. So paano natin to siya paano ma-justify ni Mill ito? For meal, although drinking a pint of beer, same example pa rin tayo, may seem to be more pleasurable than reading the Hamlet. If you are presented with these two options and you are to make a choice, each and every time or as a rule, you should still choose to read Hamlet and forgo drinking the pint of beer. Remember ha, you should each and every time or as a rule, you should still choose to read the Hamlet and forgo about drinking the beer. Reading Hamlet generates a higher quality. Remember, a higher quality. Although, although having a lower quantity of pleasure. While drinking the beer generates lower quality but with higher quantity of pleasure. So kung iisipin mo, if you have the goal why you are reading that Hamlet while drinking the beer, so may isip mo na mas magiging mas most or maraming mga benefits na good na makukuha mo to read, no, just rather than to drink beer. Like for example, let's cite another example, like mag-study mo or mag-party-party mo, 'di ba? So even though yung dalawang activity na yon is kind of make us happy or pleasure yun sa atin, but there is a goal na kailangan mong mag-study because need mong makapasa sa subject mo or sa course mo. So, kung yung dalawang pleasure na yun is nagda-doubt ka kung ano yung susundin mo, magpa-party ka ba or magsa-study ka na lang sa bahay nyo. So, kung tutuusin, kung gusto mo talaga makipag-party, siyempre, meron siyang kapalit na hindi ka makakasagot sa exam mo or hindi ka makakapasa sa course na kinukuha mo. Because mas marami nga yung pleasure na nagawa yung pagpa-party-party ninyo, pero yung quality nun is mas mababa. Kaysa dun naman sa pag-study, even though uh, mas ma mas lower yung quantity ng pleasure na yun sa inyo, pero mas mabigat or mas mataas yung quality or yung maa-attain mo na success if you will just stay in your home and just to study. In the end, class, these issues may be merely technical problems faced by Utilitarianism, is there some neutral scale of comparison between pleasures? If there is it based on Bentham's scale, which makes no distinction between higher and lower pleasures, or Mill's, which does? The more serious problem, however, remains, which is the utilitarianism seems willing in principle to sacrifice the interest and even perhaps lives of the individual for the sake of the benefit of a larger group. And this seems to conflict with our basic moral intuition that people have a right not to be used in this way. While Mill argued that the notion of rights could be accounted for on purely utilitarian terms, Bentham dismissed dismissed the notion about rights. For him, natural rights are simple nonsense, imprescriptible rights, rhetorical nonsense, and nonsense upon stilts. Okay, therefore, let us conclude by revisiting the question we started. Can the ends justify the means? So, sana naka-reflect kayo sa ganito na questions. It stated that as far as utilitarianism is concerned, the answer to this question is in the affirmative. While the answer is plausible and right for utilitarians, it is implausible for many others, and notably wrong for deontologists. As we have seen in this chapter on a close examination, utilitarianism is less persuasive and less reasonable than it appears to be when it is far away. Okay, that's the end of our lecture 5 class. I hope that you gained something new, especially the views of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. Even though in a close examination, utilitarianism is less persuasive and reasonable, but it taught us a lot, no, somehow, and we can still use this, but it would depend on the situation. And we gained some approaches, no, on how to balance our situation kung darating man yung sitwasyon na yon na nagkakaroon tayo ng doubt, no, on how to make decisions. So we can use those approaches na pinopose ng utilitarianism, and also uh, the two the two philosophers na nag-introduce sa atin ng utilitarianism. And this is our references class. Makikita yan sa book natin. And if nabitin kayo sa mga lectures or explanations, you can actually research about these references. And also, we have further readings. Okay, you can still research it. Available yan sa Google, of course. And homework. Okay, in homework class. Okay, for the instruction for this homework, after watching or listening this recorded lecture and receiving this homework instruction, kindly send a personal message that you already received this, and I will send you the link of the homework quiz. Please don't forget to state your section kapag nag-send na kayo ng message sa akin. It is actually a quiz. Of course, my deadline ito class, I will individually send the link after your confirmation until April 8, 2022. Bukas yan, Friday until 7 p.m. only. And after that class, no considerations muna. If na-open nyo ang file na ito after the deadline, so I will not send the link. Okay, that's all class. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Stay healthy and stay safe.